What kind of man begins his legend by destroying the very symbol of trust, the currency of his own city, and yet claims that in that act he discovered freedom? The story of Diogenes of Sinope does not begin with glory or acclaim. It begins with scandal. It begins with exile. It begins with the sound of coins struck, marked, and allegedly defaced, an accusation that might have ruined an ordinary man, but instead forged one of the most unyielding figures in the history of thought. To understand how a beggar could become a philosopher whose words still echo across centuries, we must begin on the shore of the Black Sea, in a bustling colony called Sinope, where commerce, law, and civic pride were bound together by silver coins that carried the city's symbol and its reputation into every marketplace of the ancient world. Sinope was a place of wealth, trade, and rising power in the 4th century before Christ. Its citizens relied upon coinage not just as a medium of exchange, but as a badge of their collective identity. To tamper with that coinage was to tamper with the honor of the city itself. It was in this context that Diogenes, and some say, even his father, became embroiled in a scandal. The charge was that they had altered the coins, perhaps adulterating their value, perhaps simply reshaping their mark. For later generations, the details became blurred, but the symbolism remained sharp. To deface the coin was not only to ruin money, but to blur the values of society itself. When the magistrates discovered this act, or believed they had, Diogenes was cast out. His citizenship, his status, his standing in the city where he was born were all stripped away. What for others would have been a shame beyond recovery, for him became a new beginning. We must imagine the young Diogenes, once the son of a banker, suddenly reduced to nothing. No land, no office, no right even to call himself a citizen of his birthplace. To be exiled in the Greek world was to become a kind of walking death. The exile had no place, no home, no inheritance. He was a man stripped naked of the protections that bound ordinary lives together. Yet this condition, which most feared as annihilation, became for Diogenes a form of liberation. He was forced to confront the possibility that all human securities, coinage, family ties, civic honors, were fragile illusions. From the very start, his life was defined by a paradox. Dishonor gave him a freedom more absolute than honor could ever provide. When he arrived in Athens, the beating heart of philosophy after Socrates, he carried little more than his body and his sharp tongue. It was there that the exiled man transformed himself into a figure who would both horrify and fascinate the Athenians. But even before his arrival in the Agora of Athens, Diogenes must have meditated on the meaning of his disgrace, for the charge of defacing the currency could be read in more than one way. To some, it meant literally altering silver. To others, it meant corrupting morals, shaking the conventions of life. Diogenes himself would later seize upon this double meaning, claiming that he had been instructed by the oracle at Delphi to alter the currency. Perhaps the oracle's words were misinterpreted, or perhaps they were intended as an allegory. In either case, Diogenes decided that if fate commanded him to alter the currency, he would do so not in silver, but in the coin of custom. He would strike at the counterfeit values of society. He would blur the images not on money, but on the human soul. The Athens that received him was no simple backdrop. Only decades earlier, the city had condemned Socrates to drink hemlock for corrupting the youth. The trauma of that trial still haunted its philosophical circles. Plato was rising to prominence, systematizing the lessons of his teacher into a vision of forms and ideals. Other schools were beginning to take shape, wrestling with questions of virtue, justice, and the nature of the good life. Into this world entered a ragged exile from the Black Sea, who refused to accept the polished words of philosophers or the polite manners of citizens. Diogenes came with the scars of scandal, the brand of exile, and the determination to live in such a way that every act of his life would be a philosophical argument. He had already lost what most men cling to most desperately: honor, home, possessions. Instead of seeking restoration, he decided to live as though these things were never worth having at all. His rejection of society's values did not come from comfortable speculation in a wealthy household. as many other thinkers could afford. It came from the cold reality of disgrace. He took exile, which for others was ruin, and remade it into a doctrine. Freedom lies in needing nothing. The one who has nothing left to lose is beyond the reach of fortune. This radical posture is why Diogenes would later be called a Socrates gone mad. Where Socrates had questioned conventions with irony and subtle probing, Diogenes smashed them apart with gestures, mockery, and scandal. But the seed of this madness was planted in Sinope. For a man who had been accused of violating the very coinage of his city, the natural response was to reject coinage altogether. For a man stripped of his status, the natural choice was to reject all status. For a man cast out, the only path was to live as though the whole world was his city, or no city at all. The tale of his early years in exile is shadowed by rumor, myth, and fragments of anecdote. Some say he sought out Antisthenes, a follower of Socrates known for his austere lifestyle. Antisthenes at first rejected him, but Diogenes persisted, determined to learn a way of life that could match his contempt for convention. Whether or not the details are precise, the essence is true. Diogenes was drawn to a philosophy of hard simplicity, a way of living stripped of luxury, a mode of existence that mocked the polished elites of Athens. He took the wound of exile and turned it into the badge of philosophy. Imagine him entering the crowded marketplace of Athens. Stalls filled with goods, men bargaining, women carrying baskets, slaves rushing on errands. Amid this scene stands a man who refuses to own property, who carries only a cloak, a staff, and later a simple cup. This figure begins to behave in ways that shock, amuse, and scandalize the crowd. He eats in public where others are ashamed. He relieves himself without embarrassment. He mocks those who boast of wealth or lineage. Each gesture is a challenge. If life's necessities can be met with ease, why do men enslave themselves to endless desires? If death comes to all, why do they cling to honors and offices as though they could preserve them forever? The exile from Sinope was not merely poor, he was a living rebuke. He turned his disgrace into a theater of philosophy. Every gesture, every insult, every refusal was aimed at demonstrating that freedom comes not from possession, but from renunciation. His life itself became the argument, an argument far more shocking than the polished debates of Plato's Academy. And behind it all stood the memory of the coins he had supposedly defaced, the symbol of a society's trust. Where others saw crime, Diogenes saw metaphor. If the coin of the realm could be corrupted, so too could the values stamped upon human hearts. To live as a philosopher was to deface the false currency of custom and mint a new one from nature itself. The scandal that began in Sinope thus became the seed of a philosophy that would echo into Stoicism and beyond. The exile's disgrace became the philosopher's freedom. The broken coin became a lamp searching for truth. Out of one man's ruin was born a way of life that would outlast empires. And so the story begins. Not with triumph, but with a question whispered across the centuries. When the values of your city turn false, is it a crime to destroy them, or the beginning of many wanderers arrive at its gates? Men who came seeking wisdom, patronage, or the glittering promise of life at the heart of Greek civilization. Yet none of them looked or behaved like the exile from Sinope. Diogenes arrived with no wealth, no retinue, no connections. He carried only the weight of his disgrace and the certainty that what he had lost in status, he had gained in freedom. For most Athenians, his appearance was jarring. A man with no sandals, wrapped in a rough cloak, his body lean from privation, his eyes sharp with suspicion and wit. To a city accustomed to philosophers who dressed in clean garments, lectured in shaded groves, and argued in measured tones, he was an unsettling sight. He had no home to retreat to and no family to support him, so the open streets, the crowded agora, and the colonnades became his dwelling. The marketplace was not just a place for him to beg for food or find a corner to sleep. It was the theater where he began to stage his philosophy. In those days, Athens was still recovering from the shadow cast by Socrates' trial and execution. The memory of that old gadfly who had embarrassed statesmen with piercing questions lingered like a ghost over the city. Plato had taken the mantle of philosophy into the realm of forms and ideals, constructing a system that reached into the heavens. Other thinkers pursued logic, mathematics, or politics. Against this backdrop, Diogenes carved out his own space by stripping philosophy of its polish and dragging it back into the dust of daily life. He believed that the true test of ideas was not in elegant speeches, but in the raw practice of living. His exile had freed him from every civic duty, every expectation of respectability. So he used that freedom to behave in ways that startled, provoked, and often offended the Athenians who watched him. At first, they laughed at the ragged man who made his bed in a discarded earthen jar, a pithos large enough to hold a grown body. Children jeered, men mocked, and women whispered when he chose to eat in public, ignoring the custom that meals belonged in private homes. But Diogenes endured their ridicule with the calm of someone who had already endured worse. He had lost a city. What were a few insults compared to exile? In fact, he relished the scorn. Every jeer reminded him that his philosophy was striking its target, the fragile pride of men who feared public shame more than they feared hunger or death. By placing himself in the center of ridicule, he demonstrated a freedom they could not imagine. In time, the laughter gave way to a strange fascination. The same Athenians who dismissed him as a mad beggar began to gather around to see what outrageous thing he might do next. They watched him curl up with dogs for warmth, or scavenge scraps from the ground, or relieve himself without apology in full view of the crowd. They saw him discard even the simplest of possessions. Once he carried a wooden cup to drink from fountains, but when he saw a child cupping water in his hands, Diogenes threw the cup away. Why cling to an object when nature itself provided what was needed? His contempt for possessions was not spoken in lectures, but enacted through a daily theater of renunciation. This public spectacle was not random madness. It was a deliberate philosophy. In every act, he aimed to prove that virtue and freedom were possible without wealth, without family, without honor, without even the basic comforts of ordinary life. He wanted to show that what most people considered shameful, poverty, begging, exposure, was in truth a path to liberation. His body became his classroom, and the agora became his stage. Each scandal was a lesson. Each humiliation was a sermon. But to live in this way was not without suffering. He endured the cold of Athens' winters with only his cloak. He endured the hunger of days when no one gave alms. He endured the blows of those who despised him for mocking their pride. He endured loneliness that few men could survive. Yet each hardship he embraced as a kind of training. In the language of the Greeks, ascesis meant exercise, discipline, a regimen to strengthen the body and soul. Diogenes turned the city itself into his gymnasium of hardship. Cold winds were his trainer. Hunger was his tutor. Insults were his drills. Every deprivation was an exercise in freedom, because to endure without complaint was to prove that nothing external could enslave him. The Athenians did not know whether to despise or admire him. Some dismissed him as a shameless dog, a nuisance with no place in civilized society. Others began to see a strange wisdom in his stubborn refusal to play by their rules. He was called the dog, and instead of resisting the insult, he embraced it. A dog, after all, needs little, sleeps where it can, barks at those who deserve it, and bites when necessary. To live like a dog was to live without the pretenses that enslaved men. The name Cynic, from the word for dog, became not only his label, but the mark of a new way of philosophy. Diogenes' rejection of convention extended to every corner of life. He questioned the value of temples filled with idols, mocking the sacrifices offered to statues. He questioned the obsession with fine houses when a man could live under the open sky. He questioned the pride of citizens in their political offices, pointing out that death and misfortune made no distinction between the rulers and the ruled. The more Athenians clung to honor and wealth, the more he stripped them away, living as proof that such things were unnecessary. His presence in the marketplace was like a mirror held up to society's vanity. When men boasted of their riches, Diogenes showed them his poverty and asked which of them was truly free. When men boasted of their noble birth, he showed them his exile and asked which of them was more secure. When men trembled at disgrace, he displayed his shamelessness and asked which of them was more powerful. He was a paradox in flesh, a beggar who lived as though he were richer than kings, a homeless man who walked the city as though it belonged to him alone. In the eyes of some, he was an embarrassment to philosophy, dragging noble ideas into the dirt. In the eyes of others, he was its purest expression, living without compromise what others only spoke of. He had no written works to defend his ideas, no scrolls to preserve his wisdom. His life itself was the book, his actions the words, his shamelessness the ink. And though Athens offered him nothing, no citizenship, no wealth, no honor, it gave him what he needed most, a stage large enough to display the radical freedom he had discovered in exile. Thus, the man who had once been disgraced in Sinope became the most notorious figure in Athens' marketplace. The exile had turned the humiliation of banishment into the power of example. He had traded the walls of his native city for the open air of the agora, the weight of coins for the weightlessness of poverty, the fragile honor of civic status for the indestructible pride of independence. In doing so, he began to shape a philosophy that would challenge not only the Athenians of his day, but generations yet to come. For in that crowded marketplace, among the sellers of grain and the buyers of fish, a man was teaching, without a school, without a roof, without even a home to claim. He was teaching that freedom is not given by city or coin, but discovered in the resilience of the soul. And the Athenians, whether they mocked him or marveled at him, could not ignore the lesson. Athens was still haunted by the absence of Socrates, the man whose questions had unsettled an empire and whose death had left a wound deeper than any Spartan spear. His trial and execution had become a defining trauma for the city, a reminder that even in the birthplace of democracy, a philosopher could be silenced when his words cut too close to the bone. Into this shadow stepped Plato, gathering disciples into his academy and attempting to rescue philosophy from the marketplace by lifting it into the realm of eternal forms. The academy's white walls, orderly discussions, and precise definitions offered a striking contrast to the chaos of the agora, where Diogenes staged his rough theater of provocation. Where Plato sought clarity and system, Diogenes embraced disorder and mockery. Where Plato refined concepts, Diogenes shattered them with gestures. The tension between the two was inevitable, and in that clash we see not only the personal rivalry of two men, but the collision of two visions of philosophy itself. Plato believed that man was defined by his rational soul, a being distinct from the animals because of his capacity for reason and contemplation. Diogenes believed that man had imprisoned himself in conventions, shackling his natural freedom with artificial chains. For Plato, philosophy was about transcending the world to glimpse higher realities. For Diogenes, it was about stripping life bare until only the essentials remained. The academy turned inward toward abstract truth, while Diogenes turned outward into the dust of the streets, searching not for ideas but for an authentic human being. Their conflict crystallized in stories that Athenians repeated with delight. Plato, in his quest for precise definitions, once described man as a featherless biped. For him, the definition was neat, logical, and scientifically accurate. Diogenes, hearing this, seized a chicken, plucked its feathers, and carried it into the academy, declaring, "Here is Plato's man." The gesture was crude, shocking, and unforgettable. Plato was forced to amend his definition with the words, "with broad, flat nails." The story may sound like a joke, but beneath it lay Diogenes' conviction that philosophy unmoored from the grid of life was hollow. To him, a definition that could be undone by a single absurd gesture was not philosophy, but verbal play. By plucking a chicken, he exposed the fragility of ideas that did not touch the reality of flesh and hunger, of death and freedom. For Diogenes, the legacy of Socrates was not in polished dialectic, but in the refusal to compromise truth for comfort. He styled himself as a Socrates gone mad, not because he lacked reason, but because he carried reason into realms too indecent for polite society. Socrates had embarrassed statesmen with questions. Diogenes embarrassed citizens with his entire way of life. Socrates had sought to awaken the soul through irony. Diogenes sought to tear away the masks with shameless acts. If Socrates was condemned for corrupting the youth, Diogenes corrupted conventions themselves, teaching the young that what society called shame was often the invention of the powerful to keep them docile. The philosophers of Athens could not ignore him. He appeared at lectures to heckle. He interrupted discussions with gestures that made words seem weak. When Plato spoke of abstractions, Diogenes would scornfully trample on his carpets, declaring that he was trampling Plato's vanity. To the polished arguments of the academy, he opposed the rough immediacy of action. To the careful order of the schools, he brought the disorder of a man who owned nothing and feared nothing. His very existence challenged the idea that philosophy needed walls, libraries, or the patronage of wealthy students. He insisted that the true philosopher could live in the open, teach without books, and embody freedom without possessions. Yet behind the laughter his provocations caused, there was unease. Diogenes' mockery forced Athenians to confront questions they would rather avoid. What is a man? Is it a definition in a book, or a life stripped to its essence? What is philosophy? Is it the pursuit of ideas too lofty for ordinary men, or is it the daily struggle to live without lies? By refusing to engage in polite disputation and instead staging his arguments in the theater of the city, Diogenes ensured that no one could dismiss him as irrelevant. His ragged figure haunted the streets like a living riddle, mocking the powerful, shaming the hypocritical, and daring the youth to imagine a life without chains. This conflict between the academy and the Cynic was more than personal rivalry. It symbolized two roads for philosophy in a city still reeling from the death of Socrates. Would philosophy retreat into cloisters of abstraction, or would it remain a scandal to society, a voice of defiance in the open square? Diogenes chose the latter path, even if it meant embracing ridicule, poverty, and isolation. He took the defiance of Socrates and stripped it of irony, turning it into blunt force. He wanted no disciples scribbling notes, no neat dialogues preserved for future readers. His disciples would be those who saw him sleep in his jar and realized that freedom was possible without possessions. Those who saw him pluck a chicken and realized that definitions were less important than authenticity. In a city still bruised by the memory of a philosopher's death, Diogenes became the embodiment of philosophy's survival. He had no need to fear the fate of Socrates, for there was nothing left in him to destroy. The state could not exile him. He had already lost a homeland. The magistrates could not strip him of honor. He had none to lose. Death itself could not rob him of wealth. He possessed nothing but his body, and even that he treated as a temporary vessel. His life was already a defiance of every power that had silenced Socrates. If Athens had tried to kill him, they would have found that there was nothing left to execute but the shell of a man who had already escaped their grasp. Thus Diogenes clashed with Plato not as one rival teacher against another, but as two visions of the human soul struggling for dominance in a city that had yet to decide what philosophy meant. One sought to ascend to the heavens, the other chose to crawl in the dirt. One built an academy, the other made the streets his stage. One polished definitions, the other shattered them with mockery. Yet both were heirs to the same wound left by Socrates, and both in their own way ensured that philosophy would not vanish from Athens. And so, in the shadow of Socrates' death, amid the gleaming walls of Plato's academy and the dust of the marketplace, Diogenes carved his path. A path not of theory, but of defiance. Not of elegance, but of raw truth. He was a living question that no definition could contain, a man whose shamelessness was a weapon sharper than any argument. His clash with Plato was not merely a quarrel of philosophers, but the stage upon which philosophy itself declared its unwillingness to be silenced, where the sun at midday burned white against marble colonnades, and the cries of merchants filled the air. Diogenes carried a small lantern. It was an object that made no sense in broad daylight, a gesture so absurd that people stopped in their tracks to stare. The lamp's flame flickered against the brilliance of the noonday sun, feeble and ridiculous. Yet Diogenes walked deliberately through the crowded marketplace with the lamp held high. When asked what he was doing, he gave the answer that turned the scene into legend. He was searching for a man. The words sounded cryptic, almost like a riddle. But for those who knew Diogenes, they cut deep. Athens was full of men, statesmen, merchants, philosophers, generals, yet he suggested that none were truly human in the sense that mattered. He implied that the city was crowded with shadows, with masks, with pretenders. He sought authenticity, a soul uncorrupted by vanity, greed, or cowardice. The lantern became more than a flame. It became a symbol of philosophy itself, a desperate attempt to find honesty in a world that drowned in lies. The Athenians laughed but uneasily. They could not ignore the sting, for Diogenes' life was already an accusation. He exposed the city's obsession with wealth by discarding possessions. He mocked its hunger for honor by embracing shame. Now, with a lamp in daylight, he accused its citizens of being less than human, of lacking the very thing they prided themselves on: reason, integrity, courage. The gesture was comic on the surface but tragic in its implication. That in a city that had given birth to democracy, art, and philosophy, a man could wander with a lamp and still not find a single human being worthy of the name? The lantern scene was not an isolated prank, but the culmination of Diogenes' way of teaching. He believed that words were too easily twisted, too easily forgotten. A lecture could be countered, a book could be ignored, but a gesture that shocked the senses could not be erased. The image of a man with a lantern at noon burned into memory in a way that no abstract discourse could. It was philosophy as theater, an embodied metaphor, a sermon made of flame and ridicule. But the lamp was also a confession of despair. If Diogenes truly sought an honest man and could not find one, then his life was a quest without fulfillment. The flame he carried was as fragile as the possibility of virtue in a corrupt world. The wind could extinguish it at any moment, just as hypocrisy and cowardice could smother truth. To carry it in broad daylight was to admit that virtue had become so rare it required a searchlight. He was not simply mocking others. He was mourning the loss of integrity in a city that claimed to be the teacher of Greece. Yet even in that mourning, there was hope. For in the very act of searching, Diogenes declared that authenticity still mattered. He would not have raised the lamp if he believed the quest was impossible. His ridicule was also a challenge. If none could be found, then someone must rise to become what he sought. The lantern dared his audience to prove him wrong, to live with honesty so undeniable that even a cynic with a lamp at noon would acknowledge them as human. This paradox, mockery intertwined with hope, was the essence of Diogenes' teaching. He could shame a citizen by eating scraps in public, but he did it to show that shame was misplaced. He could ridicule a philosopher with a plucked chicken, but he did it to expose how fragile ideas were when cut off from reality. He could hold a lantern in the sun, but he did it to remind the city that the light of truth was dim compared to the brightness of custom and deceit. Every act was double-edged, both comedy and tragedy, insult and invitation. Athens, with all its splendor, was fertile ground for this theater. Its wealth made Diogenes' poverty all the more striking. Its politics made his indifference to citizenship all the more scandalous. Its schools of philosophy made his living gestures all the more provocative. He was a mirror held up to the city, and what the citizens saw reflected was not flattering. Beneath their fine garments and polished speeches, they saw shadows. Beneath their proud titles and family lineages, they saw masks. The lamp at noon was a reminder that in all their striving, they had lost sight of what it meant to live with integrity. And yet, for all his disdain, Diogenes did not retreat from the city. He did not flee to mountains or deserts like later ascetics. He chose to remain in the very heart of the marketplace, among the noise and corruption, carrying his lamp. This choice revealed something crucial. He was not only condemning society, but also engaging with it. He wanted to provoke, to awaken, to force confrontation. His rejection of convention was not a withdrawal, but an invasion. He took the battle for truth into the agora itself, insisting that philosophy must live where the people lived, that it must wrestle with daily life rather than retreat into ivory towers. The image of the lamp endured long after his death, retold by later writers as the most vivid example of Cynic philosophy. It encapsulated everything he stood for: simplicity, shamelessness, and a relentless search for authenticity. It also pointed toward the future, for the Cynics would pass their torch to the Stoics, who would turn this radical individualism into a broader philosophy of natural law and cosmopolitan duty. The lamp was more than an anecdote. It was a spark that lit a chain of thought stretching across centuries. For those who watched him that day in Athens, the memory must have lingered long after the laughter faded. They saw a ragged man in the blaze of noon, carrying a fragile flame against the sun. They saw mockery in his gesture, but also an unsettling truth. They saw themselves accused of being less than human, and they wondered, perhaps in secret, what it would take to prove him wrong. And so Diogenes walked, the exile with no home, the beggar with no possessions, the philosopher with no books, carrying a lantern at noon in search of a man. The absurdity of the image was its genius, for in its absurdity lay the enduring question, if one must search in daylight for a human being, what has become of humanity? To the Athenians, the ragged exile from Sinope was an irritant, a spectacle, and an embarrassment. They gave him a name meant as insult, calling him the dog. In Greek, the word was kaion, and from that word his philosophy would take its title, Cynicism. The comparison was not flattering. To live like a dog was to live without shame, to eat scraps, to bark and bite, to lie exposed to wind and cold. But Diogenes, with the same shameless defiance that had marked his every act, embraced the insult and transformed it into his identity. If they wished to call him a dog, then a dog he would be, and he would show them that in the virtues of the animal lay a truth that human pretension had forgotten. A dog, after all, needs little. It eats when food is available, sleeps wherever it can find shelter, drinks when it is thirsty. It does not build houses, hoard wealth, or flatter rulers. It barks when threatened, and it shows loyalty to those who treat it well. In the simplicity of the animal's life, Diogenes saw a mirror of what human existence could be if stripped of vanity and convention. To live like a dog was to live according to nature, free from the chains of society's illusions. And so he wore the name dog as a badge of honor, letting it define not his disgrace but his freedom. His life in Athens became an experiment in canine philosophy. He slept under porticos, curled in his cloak like a stray. He begged for food as dogs beg at the tables of the wealthy, enduring scorn and kicks with the same indifference an animal shows to the cruelty of men. When he was hungry, he ate whatever was given, whether stale bread or rotting scraps. When cold, he lay in the sun. When hot, he sought shade. In every action, he demonstrated that life's needs were few, and that to desire more was to enslave oneself to false masters. The Athenians were scandalized most not by his poverty, but by his shamelessness. For Diogenes sought to erase the line between what is natural and what is made shameful by custom. He relieved himself in public, mocking the idea that bodily functions should be hidden as though they were crimes. He ate in the marketplace, insisting that if eating was necessary to live, it should be no more shameful in public than in private. He performed even more shocking acts, deliberately choosing to display in public what others concealed in secret, as if to declare that nature itself was innocent and that it was society which had created false categories of sin. His philosophy was not abstract but embodied, and the body was the battleground on which he waged war against convention. Yet beneath the outrageous acts lay a consistent vision. He believed that freedom could not coexist with dependence. To need possessions, to crave honors, to fear shame, to obey custom, these were chains heavier than iron. To break them, one had to return to the innocence of the animal, which lived according to nature alone. He sought autarkia, self-sufficiency, the capacity to be content with whatever life provided, and he sought anaideia, the shamelessness that comes from refusing to let society dictate what is honorable or disgraceful. To live without shame was to be free. This shameless freedom gave him a boldness that startled even his critics. He confronted those who strutted in fine robes, asking them whether their dignity lay in their clothing or their souls. He mocked the lavish banquets of the wealthy by feasting on crumbs in the dirt. He ridiculed generals who boasted of victories, reminding them that death leveled all distinctions. He became a kind of barking conscience, snapping at the heels of Athens to remind it that its greatness was fragile and its pride hollow. But his embrace of the canine also carried a moral lesson deeper than mockery. Dogs, unlike men, are loyal without deceit. They defend their masters not for pay or honors, but out of instinct. They fight when threatened and rest when safe. Diogenes suggested that if men could recover the simplicity of the dog, its honesty, its lack of pretense, they would rediscover a form of virtue that no law or custom could corrupt. The dog, despised as shameless, became in his eyes a teacher of integrity. Of course, not everyone saw it this way. Many despised him as filthy, mad, or obscene, yet some began to recognize a strange consistency in his life. He did not beg for wealth and then hoard it. He did not flatter rulers and then curse them. He lived exactly as he preached, stripping life down to its bones. That uncompromising authenticity attracted a few followers, young men disillusioned by the emptiness of Athenian society. They saw in the ragged dog a courage that their polished teachers lacked, the courage to live the truth without apology. The contrast between Diogenes and his contemporaries became ever sharper. Plato built dialogues filled with noble words, but Diogenes lived in ways that mocked those words. Orators filled the assembly with promises and arguments, but Diogenes dismissed them as slaves to power. Merchants boasted of wealth, but he showed that freedom lay in desiring nothing. Every act of his life was a rebuke to the false coinage of society. He was the dog who barked at pretense, bit hypocrisy, and slept content under the open sky. The image of Diogenes as a dog spread beyond Athens, shaping how he was remembered. Later writers described him not only as shameless, but as fearless, a man who turned insult into armor. His canine philosophy would echo in the Cynic tradition, carried on by crates of Thebes and passed into the Stoic school. But in his own lifetime, it was a scandal that made him notorious. He embodied the paradox of a man reduced to nothing, who yet lived as though he were richer than kings. To be a dog was to be despised and yet free, to be beaten and yet unchained, to live in dirt and yet mock the gilded halls of the powerful. In embracing the insult, Diogenes turned the world upside down. He showed that a man called a dog could live more fully as a human being than those who prided themselves on their dignity. The very name meant to degrade him became the cornerstone of a philosophy that would endure long after Athens itself had fallen into ruin. And so he lived, the dog of Athens, snarling at vanity, gnawing at convention, baring his teeth at hypocrisy. He lay curled in his jar, watched by crowds who laughed and scorned, but his life carried a ferocity that their comforts could not match. He had become what they accused him of, and in doing so, he revealed their own chains more clearly than any argument. The dog had become a philosopher, and the philosopher had become a mirror in which Athens saw its own corruption alive with anticipation when the young conqueror arrived. Alexander of Macedon, still in the early bloom of his meteoric rise, had already made himself the master of Greece and was preparing to launch his campaigns into Asia. Cities trembled before him, kings measured their loyalty against his favor, and philosophers whispered about the arrival of a man who dreamed not merely of ruling a city, but of ruling the world. His very presence in Corinth was enough to make statesmen bow, generals posture, and poets sharpen their pens. For many, Alexander was the embodiment of human ambition, the living promise that nothing was beyond the reach of a will forged in fire. Yet in that same city lived a man who had stripped ambition down to its bones and cast it aside like a rotting cloak. Diogenes had made Corinth his home in much the same way he had made Athens his theater. He lived not in palaces but in the open air, curling himself into his jar, walking barefoot along the dusty roads, and mocking the citizens who flocked to Alexander's court. He remained indifferent to the excitement that surrounded the conqueror's presence. For him, kingship was nothing but another mask, another form of slavery to desire. While others trembled at the chance to meet the Macedonian lion, Diogenes basked in the sunlight, as content in his poverty as Alexander was restless in his conquests. It was inevitable that the two would meet, for Alexander was as curious as he was ambitious. He had been raised on tales of Homer, on stories of Achilles and Odysseus, and he fancied himself not only a warrior, but a seeker of wisdom. He sought out philosophers to test his mind against theirs, and in Corinth he heard of the infamous Cynic who lived like a dog and feared no one. Intrigued, Alexander went to find him, accompanied by his entourage of guards and officials, men who expected the ragged beggar to tremble before their master. They found Diogenes reclining in the sun, his cloak draped loosely around his emaciated frame, his body stretched out with the ease of a man who desired nothing more than the warmth of light. He did not rise when Alexander approached, did not bow, did not even look impressed. To the conqueror's men, it was an outrage. To Alexander, it was fascinating. He stood before the Cynic and offered him what few men had ever been offered. Anything. Riches, power, protection, a position at court. All were within the grasp of the beggar if he would only ask. And then came the reply that would echo across centuries. Diogenes did not ask for gold or land or soldiers. He did not ask for safety or favor. He asked only that Alexander step aside, for he was blocking the sun. In that moment, the entire edifice of ambition, power, and conquest collapsed into a single absurdity. The man who ruled nations could not give what the philosopher truly valued, for the only thing Diogenes desired was sunlight, and even that the king's body threatened to obscure. The conqueror stood helpless before the poverty of a man who wanted nothing. For those who witnessed the exchange, it was a paradox that defied comprehension. Alexander had armies, wealth, and destiny, yet here was a man who was richer than he, because nothing could be taken from him. Diogenes possessed no throne, no soldiers, no empire, but he held a freedom that kings could not command. The crowd murmured, stunned by the audacity. Some called it insolence, others madness. But to Alexander it was brilliance. The conqueror, so used to submission, encountered for the first time a man who could not be conquered because he had already stripped himself of everything conquerors seize. The legend deepened when reflecting on the encounter. Alexander is said to have declared, "If I were not Alexander, I would be Diogenes." It was an acknowledgement not only of admiration, but of envy. Alexander's greatness lay in possession, in conquest, in ambition without limit. Diogenes' greatness lay in renunciation, in freedom from desire, in a life that needed nothing. Each in his own way embodied the extremes of human possibility. One ruled the world, the other ruled himself. One gathered kingdoms, the other discarded even a cup. Their meeting was not merely a clash of personalities, but a symbolic confrontation between empire and philosophy, between ambition and contentment, between the hunger to possess and the courage to need nothing. The story spread quickly, retold by citizens who sensed its power. In taverns and schools and courts and markets, the tale of Alexander and Diogenes was repeated, embroidered, and preserved. It became the defining anecdote of Cynic philosophy, proof that true freedom lies not in ruling others, but in mastering oneself. To live like Diogenes was to be unconquerable, because no army could strip him of the one thing he valued, independence of soul. Yet beneath the legend lay a deeper truth about Diogenes' life. His philosophy was not a posture assumed for dramatic effect. He had been tested by exile, by hunger, by cold, by mockery, by violence. He had endured all and found himself unbroken. His shamelessness, his simplicity, his indifference to comfort had forged in him a resilience that no king could rival. When Alexander offered him the world, he did not refuse out of arrogance, but out of authenticity. He truly did not need it. To him, the empire was just another chain, another trap, another distraction from the only freedom worth having. For Alexander, the encounter was a curiosity, a story to tell, a spark of humility in his otherwise relentless march. For Diogenes, it was nothing more than another day in the sun. He did not seek to impress, did not crave immortality. And yet immortality found him, for the tale of their meeting has endured longer than the walls of Corinth, longer than the empire Alexander built, longer than the marble temples that have crumbled into dust. The beggar and the king became locked together in memory, one as the conqueror of worlds, the other as the conqueror of desire. In that brief moment of sunlight, the paradox of human existence was laid bare. Alexander sought to possess everything, yet still desired more. Diogenes possessed nothing, yet desired nothing more than what he already had. Between them stretched the entire horizon of human longing, from ambition without end to contentment without need. And the world, hearing their story, has never ceased to wonder which of them was truly the man's identity was bound tightly to his city, where citizenship determined one's rights, honor, and very sense of belonging. Diogenes uttered words so radical that they startled even those accustomed to his provocations. When asked where he came from, he replied simply, "I am a citizen of the world," in Greek, cosmopolites. It was a phrase no one had heard before, a word that fused together two concepts rarely joined. A citizen was always of a polis, a city, a bounded place with walls, laws, and rituals. The cosmos was the universe itself, infinite and without borders. To claim citizenship of the world was to declare independence from every city and every law, to proclaim that one's home was everywhere and nowhere at once. The declaration was more than rhetoric. For Diogenes, it was the logical extension of his life. Exiled from Sinope, stripped of civic standing, rejected by convention, he had learned to live as though belonging itself was an illusion. If a man could live with nothing, he could live anywhere. If he owed allegiance to no city, then he was free to call the entire world his home. In those few words, Diogenes shattered the framework of Greek political life, which prized citizenship above all else. He transformed exile into universality, disgrace into liberation. This idea was dangerous in its simplicity. To be a citizen of the world meant rejecting the divisions that pitted city against city, that sparked wars and rivalries, that chained men to loyalties they had never chosen. It meant looking beyond walls and laws to something deeper, the shared nature of humanity. For Diogenes, if virtue was possible, it was not confined to Athens or Sparta or Corinth. It was as universal as breath. His philosophy, grounded in poverty and shamelessness, had led him to an insight that would ripple far beyond his lifetime. The possibility of cosmopolitanism, the idea that every human being belonged to a single moral community. The Athenians, proud of their citizenship, recoiled from the idea. Their democracy, their laws, their privileges were precious precisely because they were exclusive. To claim that these boundaries were irrelevant was to insult the very foundation of their identity. Yet Diogenes stood in their midst, possessing no status, no rights, and mocked their pride. He insisted that freedom did not come from civic honors, but from independence of soul. He asked why men would kill to defend city walls when the world itself could not be contained. He lived the proof, wandering from city to city, carrying his life in a cloak, untouched by the fear of exile, because he belonged to no single place. In this universality, there was both liberation and loneliness. To reject all ties meant to embrace a vast emptiness, to walk through life without the comforts of belonging. Diogenes bore that solitude as he bore hunger and cold, turning it into another form of discipline. His self-sufficiency allowed him to treat every city as a temporary lodging, every stranger as a fellow being, every place as home, and no place as final. The world was both his house and his wilderness. The radical nature of his claim did not pass unnoticed. Later philosophers, especially the Stoics, would build upon it, transforming the Cynic's raw declaration into a structured ethic of natural law in universal brotherhood. For them, to be a citizen of the world was to recognize that reason, implanted in every soul, made us kin. They would draw from Diogenes' scandalous words the seed of a philosophy that spoke to emperors and slaves alike. Yet in his own time, his proclamation was still more insult than system, more challenge than doctrine. It was a defiant gesture hurled against the pride of cities and the narrowness of belonging. But we must not mistake the provocation for emptiness. Diogenes' cosmopolitanism was not abstract. It was lived in the grit of daily existence. When he begged for food in Athens, he did not beg as a foreigner, but as a man who claimed the right to be sustained by fellow humans. When he mocked a magistrate in Corinth, he did not mock as an outsider, but as a member of a larger community that owed him no less honesty. His life itself was the demonstration that the walls of cities could not contain the human spirit. He lived outside them, above them, through them, refusing to be defined by them. The paradox of his cosmopolitanism was that it emerged not from privilege but from utter deprivation. He had no family, no city, no possessions. He turned that emptiness into universality. In the void left by exile, he built a home as wide as the sky. In the absence of citizenship, he claimed the universe. The very condition most men feared, the loss of identity, became for him the foundation of freedom. And so the Cynic walked the streets proclaiming that he was a citizen of the world, mocking the pride of men who boasted of Athens or Sparta, declaring that their walls were illusions, their honors counterfeit. The laughter of the crowd could not erase the sting, for in their hearts they knew that their citizenship was fragile, bound to laws and decrees, vulnerable to war and fortune. But the ragged philosopher, with no polis to claim him, walked with a freedom they could not grasp. This was the deepest irony of Diogenes' life. The exile, the beggar, the man called a dog, was the first to see beyond the narrow limits of the polis. In rejecting everything, he discovered the possibility of belonging to all. His lamp had searched for a man in Athens, and perhaps he realized that to find one, he would have to look beyond Athens itself. The true human being could not be confined within city walls, but belonged to the cosmos. And in that vision, he anticipated an idea that would echo through Stoic philosophy, through Roman law, through the very concept of universal human rights. The words were simple, almost careless. I am a citizen of the world, but they contained a revolution. They turned exile into a gift, disgrace into universality, poverty into independence. They revealed a paradox that continues to unsettle the human imagination, that sometimes the man with nothing belongs everywhere, and the men with everything are trapped in walls of their own making. Among the fragments that survive of Diogenes' thought, there is mention of a book he wrote, now lost, called Politeia, the Republic. In its time, the word carried heavy weight. Plato had already composed a dialogue of that name, a sweeping vision of an ideal state governed by philosopher kings, bound together by justice and hierarchy. It was a lofty architecture of words, a structure built in imagination, filled with rules and divisions. Diogenes' Republic, by contrast, was not built with marble or dialogue, but with ridicule. His vision was meant not to exalt society, but to expose it, not to lay foundations, but to tear them up. Where Plato dreamed of order, Diogenes described chaos. Where Plato imagined the noble city, Diogenes imagined the republic of dogs. The details come to us in shards, preserved by later writers who either recoiled in horror or laughed at the audacity. In Diogenes' Republic, there was no private property, no sacred marriage, no inheritance. Wives and children, he suggested, should be held in common, dissolving the most intimate bonds of human life into shared possession. He attacked the household, that sacred unit of Greek society, with the same ferocity with which he mocked wealth and honor. For him, family was another form of slavery, a chain binding man to duty, to pride, to legacy. In its place, he envisioned a community stripped bare of illusions, where nothing was private, where all was exposed, where men and women lived like animals under the law of nature alone. To the Athenians and Corinthians who heard of it, the suggestion was obscene. Marriage was the cornerstone of civic life. Inheritance passed down wealth and status. The family ensured continuity of name and honor. To abolish these bonds was to abolish civilization itself, and perhaps that was precisely his point. Diogenes was not proposing a constitution to be enacted by statesmen. He was holding up a grotesque mirror to society's conventions. By describing a world in which property, marriage, and family were erased, he forced his listeners to confront the fragility of the institutions they considered eternal. If these structures could be imagined away, were they truly natural, or were they only customs dressed up as necessity? His republic was scandal masquerading as philosophy, parody masquerading as law. In its audacity lay its force. By pushing every idea to the edge of absurdity, Diogenes revealed the arbitrary nature of social conventions. Why, he asked, should one man claim ownership of land when nature provided it freely? Why should marriage be bound by contracts when desire followed no law? Why should inheritance elevate a fool because of his birth while virtue was ignored in the poor? His republic gave extreme answers, dissolving every boundary, mocking every bond, insisting that nature alone should rule. And yet, as much as it horrified his contemporaries, there was a thread of seriousness woven into the satire. Diogenes believed that the pursuit of possessions, of family pride, of legacy, chained men to illusions. He had lived without them and found freedom. His republic was not a plan for governance but a radical declaration. The only true state is the state of nature. The only true citizen, the man who has stripped away every convention. If Plato's republic was an ascent into the realm of ideals, Diogenes' republic was a descent into raw existence, a plunge into the life of dogs. It was not without irony that both men bore the same title for their visions, as if locked in eternal debate. Plato raised philosophy above the city, shaping laws and guardians in dialogue. Diogenes dragged philosophy into the dirt, proposing laws that shattered the very notion of law. Their two republics stood as opposites, reflecting two roads for philosophy, one that sought perfection through order, another that sought freedom through destruction. Neither was meant to be realized in practice, but both became enduring symbols of what philosophy could imagine. The Republic of Dogs was also an extension of Diogenes' lived defiance. He had already rejected possessions, mocked marriage, and ridiculed inheritance by living as though none of them mattered. His book gave words to the life he embodied. For him, writing was not enough. He wrote with his actions, and his actions made his republic visible. Every time he begged for bread, every time he mocked a banquet, every time he turned shame into laughter, he was enacting the constitution of his strange city. He was its only citizen, its only lawgiver, its only philosopher king. What made his republic unforgettable was not the content of its laws, but the challenge it posed. Could society survive if stripped of its illusions? Could men endure without the comforts of property, family, and pride? The Republic dared its audience to imagine a life where the only law was nature and the only virtue was freedom. It unsettled them because it revealed how much of their lives was built on convention, not necessity. They recoiled from its obscenity but could not forget its question. In this way, Diogenes used outrage as philosophy. His Republic was a provocation, a satire aimed at the heart of Greek society. It was never meant to be implemented. It was meant to be remembered. And remembered it was, passed down through centuries as the most radical vision of a man who sought nothing and feared nothing. Even in fragments, it continues to shock, reminding us that the bonds we take for granted are not unbreakable, that the walls we build around family, property, and honor are fragile inventions. The Republic of Dogs was the dark twin of Plato's shining city, the parody that revealed the absurdity of human pretension. In mocking the laws of men, Diogenes pointed to the laws of nature. In tearing down the pillars of society, he exposed the illusions that made them stand. And in living as though his republic already existed, he became its only citizen, wandering through the cities of Greece as an exile who belonged everywhere and nowhere, proclaiming freedom in a world bound by change. His life was as enigmatic as the life he had lived. For a man who rejected permanence, who discarded possessions and mocked the need for legacy, even death could not escape the pull of legend. The sources disagree, and each account is tinged with irony, as if storytellers could not resist giving the cynic a death that mirrored his philosophy. Some said he died from eating raw octopus, a stubborn act of shamelessness that finally betrayed his body. Others claimed he was bitten by a dog, the very creature whose nature he had embraced. Still others told that he simply held his breath and let life go, mastering even the final act of existence by choosing its end. The truth is lost, but the variations reveal how deeply his life had already entered myth, how his death became an extension of the theater he had staged in every marketplace. What is clear is that he died in Corinth, the same city where he had met Alexander, the conqueror whose empire stretched across continents. While Alexander marched east to claim Persia, Diogenes lay down in the sun and never rose. The timing was symbolic. The world's most ambitious man and the world's most renunciant man had crossed paths, and now their fates diverged, one consumed by endless conquest, the other consumed by nothing at all. In death as in life, they stood as opposites, mirrors of human possibility. When the Corinthians discovered that the old philosopher was gone, they did not cast him out as he had once demanded. For he had often said that when he died, his body should be thrown beyond the city walls to be devoured by beasts, since the carcass was of no use to him. But the citizens could not bring themselves to dishonor him in that way. They gave him a burial with respect, erecting a monument that declared their strange admiration for the beggar who had mocked them. The man who had rejected all honors was honored despite himself, as if society needed to claim him even in death, to domesticate the wildness that had unsettled them in life. Statues of Diogenes soon appeared in other cities, his ragged form carved in stone, his lamp preserved in bronze. These monuments were paradoxes, for they celebrated a man who despised monuments, yet they testify to the power of his example. The citizens who had laughed at him, scorned him, and sometimes beaten him could not erase the memory of his defiance. In honoring him, they confessed their fascination with the freedom he embodied. Even those who rejected his way of life could not ignore its challenge. The anecdotes of his life multiplied after his death, told and retold by philosophers, poets, and satirists. Some emphasized his wit, others his shamelessness, others his encounters with the mighty. Each story carried a sting, a moral, a paradox. In the centuries that followed, Diogenes became less a man than a symbol, the archetype of the philosopher who rejects all convention to live according to nature. His name became shorthand for poverty chosen freely, for shameless truth-telling, for the defiance of power. But his legacy was more than stories. He left behind a school, though not in the form of an institution with walls or rules. His disciples, most famously Crates of Thebes, carried forward the Cynic way of life, living in poverty, mocking convention, and teaching that virtue lies in independence from desire. Through Crates, the spirit of Diogenes flowed into Zeno of Citium, who founded Stoicism. And through Stoicism, his influence extended into Rome, shaping the minds of emperors and statesmen, echoing in the words of Seneca, Epictetus, and Marcus Aurelius. What began in the jar of a beggar became a philosophy that guided rulers of the world. The paradox deepened. Diogenes, who wrote little, who scorned the trappings of schools and disciples, became the ancestor of one of the most enduring traditions in Western thought. His rejection became the foundation of a new order. His shamelessness gave birth to an ethic of resilience. His lamp of mockery lit the path toward universal reason. The dog of Athens, despised and mocked, became the progenitor of a philosophy that comforted men in prisons, on thrones, and on battlefields. His life was the seed, his defiance the root, his freedom the branch from which Stoicism would blossom. And so his legacy outlived the cities that scorned him. The walls of Athens crumbled. The empires of Macedon and Rome rose and fell, but the image of Diogenes remained, the man in the jar, the lamp at noon, the beggar who mocked kings. His death did not end his provocation. It only freed it to echo across centuries. He had lived as though nothing mattered but freedom, and in death his freedom became immortal. What remains most powerful is not the uncertainty of how he died, but the certainty of what his life revealed. That a man can lose everything, home, honor, possessions, family, and still live with dignity. That truth can be spoken not only with words but with actions that scandalize and unsettle. That freedom is not granted by rulers or secured by wealth, but discovered in the refusal to need. Diogenes' death, however it happened, was the final act of a life that turned disgrace into triumph, exile into universality, poverty into wealth of the soul. The Corinthians laid him to rest, but his spirit could not be contained. He remained the gadfly of history, a voice barking from the past, a lamp flickering in memory. And for those who heard his story, whether they admired or despised him, the question lingered. Who was freer, the conqueror who died far from home, dreaming of new empires, or the beggar who died in the sun, content with nothing? Diogenes wandered through the streets of Athens and Corinth, his cloak ragged, his body thin, his tongue sharp as steel, and his lantern flickering in the daylight. Yet his figure remains alive in memory, not as a mere relic of philosophy, but as a symbol of defiance against the illusions that enslaved mankind. His life, so scandalous in its own time, became a legend repeated in whispers, written in anecdotes, carved into stone, and passed from mouth to mouth across generations. And as the dust of empires settled, his lamp seemed to burn ever brighter, a fragile flame that refused to be extinguished. The world he mocked has long since vanished. The Athenian marketplace, where he shocked citizens with his shamelessness, lies in ruins, its stones scattered and its voices silenced. Corinth, where he spoke to Alexander and found his final rest, was sacked and rebuilt and sacked again, its grandeur fading into fragments. Even the empire of Alexander, which stretched across continents, broke apart within a single generation, its marble cities swallowed by sand and time. Yet Diogenes, the beggar who claimed nothing, outlasted them all. His lamp of ridicule became a torch carried by others, and his radical poverty became a wealth of influence richer than any king's treasure. The cynics who followed him walked the same path, stripping life down to its bones, mocking conventions, and proclaiming freedom through shameless simplicity. Crates of Thebes gave up wealth to live as Diogenes had lived, and in his example inspired Zeno of Citium, who would build the edifice of Stoicism upon the foundations of Cynicism. From there, the current of his thought flowed into Rome, into the writings of Seneca, into the lectures of Epictetus, into the meditations of Marcus Aurelius, an emperor who ruled the known world yet sought consolation in the discipline of the soul. From the jar of a beggar to the throne of an emperor, the flame of Diogenes spread, transforming ridicule into resilience, shamelessness into strength. But the influence of Diogenes cannot be measured only in the schools that trace their lineage to him. His defiance seeped into the cultural imagination. Artists sculpted him as the ragged sage, wrapped in his cloak holding his lantern. Poets invoked him as the voice of fearless truth, mocking hypocrisy. Satirists claimed him as a patron of ridicule. Even those who despised his obscenity could not ignore his consistency, for he lived what he taught, without compromise, without apology. His life remained a mirror in which every generation could see the masks it wore, the illusions it clung to, the chains it mistook for freedom. The paradox of Diogenes' legacy is that a man who rejected fame achieved immortality, that one who shunned honor became honored, that one who scorned possessions left behind treasures of thought that outlasted empires. He did not seek disciples, yet he founded a movement. He did not write volumes, yet he inspired libraries. He did not build monuments, yet his image stands in museums and squares. His greatness lay not in what he accumulated, but in what he stripped away, not in what he possessed, but in what he refused. And so, what are we to make of this man who lived like a dog, who mocked kings, who begged in the streets, who carried a lantern at noon? Was he a clown, a madman, a saint, a philosopher? The answer is all of these, and none. He was a living contradiction, a man whose very existence was a question, whose gestures were arguments, whose shamelessness was truth spoken in flesh. He was not content to talk about freedom, he became free. He was not content to analyze hypocrisy, he exposed it with laughter. He was not content to define man, he searched for one with a lamp in daylight, knowing that the search itself was the point. In the end, the image that endures is not his jar, or his staff, or even his plucked chicken-mocking Plato. It is the lantern, fragile, absurd, unnecessary in the brightness of noon, yet carried with stubborn persistence. The lamp is philosophy itself, a faint light held up against the blinding sun of convention, a flame that seems useless yet reveals more truth than daylight alone. It is the symbol of the eternal search, for honesty, for authenticity, for humanity. It flickers in every age, reminding us that truth must be sought, that virtue must be defended, that freedom must be lived, not merely imagined. Diogenes died long ago, yet his lamp remains. It burns whenever a voice dares to mock power, whenever a life is lived without need of possessions, whenever a man or woman refuses to wear the mask that society demands. It burns in the courage to be shameless in the service of truth, in the resilience to endure hardship with dignity, in the audacity to say to emperors, "You give me nothing I do not already possess." The lamp burns still, fragile and eternal, a flame of defiance carried forward by those who refuse to be chained. And so the story of Diogenes ends as it began, with a paradox. The man who was exiled from his city became a citizen of the world. The man who was mocked as a dog became the teacher of kings. The man who defaced coins minted values that outlasted nations. The man who owned nothing left behind a wealth that no empire could destroy. And the lamp he carried at noon, that foolish flame in the brightness of day, still burns in memory, lighting the way for those who dare to search for a human being among the shadows.